A billionaire collector stood up in front of 300 people at a classic car show, pointed at a gleaming silver Porsche that hadn't run in 2 years, and announced that he'd pay $1 million cash to anybody who could make it start. He said it with a smirk, the way a man says a thing he's certain is safe to say. He'd had the best restoration shop in the country tear that engine down to the bolts and build it back twice, and it still wouldn't turn over. And the way he figured it, if those experts couldn't do it, then nobody in a room full of weekend hobbyists and small-town grease monkeys was going to embarrass him by doing it for $1 million. It was a stunt. It was him being rich and bored and a little cruel, dangling a fortune he never expected to pay, so he could stand there and watch a bunch of working men fail and feel big about it. I was standing in the back, in my work boots, with my 7-year-old daughter on my shoulders, and I want to tell you what I did. I raised my hand, and 40 minutes later I started that Porsche with a $6 bolt, and the look on that man's face when it roared to life, and what came out about why that car really wouldn't start, is a thing I will be smiling about for the rest of my life. I'm going to tell you the whole thing, but let me say one quick thing first, and then I'll get out of my own way. I'm not going to beg you to subscribe, I'll just make you a promise instead. Every story I tell on this channel is one I'd tell you across a workbench with the radio on low, true and unhurried and worth your time. If that sounds like your kind of place, the subscribe button's down there, and I'd be glad to have you. Now, let me tell you about my dad, because you can't understand that $6 bolt without him. My name is Russ Calloway. I'm 45 years old, and I'm a mechanic, same as my father was, and his father before him. I run a little 2-bay garage out on the county road. Calloway & Son, the sign says, except the son is me now, and the Calloway who started it is gone. My dad passed 4 years ago, and he left me the shop, the tools, a mountain of debt, and just about everything I know that's worth knowing. I'm a single dad myself. My girl Nina is 7. Her mother and I split when she was little, and Nina spends about half her time with me, which mostly means half her time at the garage, doing her homework on the workbench and handing me wrenches and being, no exaggeration, the best company a man ever had. I should tell you, the shop was in trouble, real trouble, that whole stretch. When my dad got sick at the end, the bills came the way they come for working people without much cushion, fast and merciless, and by the time he passed, the garage that should have been free and clear after 50 years was mortgaged to the rafters to pay for the dying. I'd been treading water ever since, 4 years of it, robbing 1 month to pay the last, watching the place my granddad built slip a little further under every quarter. There were nights, after Nina was asleep, that I sat at that workbench with the bills spread out and did the math and came up short and wondered how much longer I could hold the doors open. I never let her see that part. A kid shouldn't carry her dad's worry, but I want you to know where I was, financially and otherwise. The Saturday I took my girl to look at pretty cars. I was a proud man quietly going under, doing the only work I knew, in a shop with my family's name on it that I was terrified of losing. That's the man who raised his hand in the back of that crowd. It matters later. Now, I'm not a fancy mechanic. I don't have the diagnostic computers the dealerships have, or the clean show floor bays. What I have is 40 years of watching and doing, half of it at my father's elbow, and a way of thinking about machines that you can't buy and you can't download, because it was beaten into me one patient lesson at a time by a man who could fix anything with a wheel or a motor and never once raised his voice doing it. And here's the thing about my dad, the thing that matters for this whole story. He had a saying. He must have said it to me 10,000 times, starting when I was about Nina's age, standing on a milk crate so I could see into an engine bay. Whenever something electrical wouldn't work, a car that wouldn't start, a light that wouldn't light, anything, before he touched anything expensive, before he even thought about the fancy stuff, he'd say, "Russ, check the grounds first." Always the grounds. Electricity's just like a person, son. It's no good to anybody until it's got a way to get home. And then he'd find the loose ground, the corroded strap, the bolt somebody forgot to tighten, and the thing would work, and he'd wipe his hands and say, "See? It just needed a way home." 90% of the electrical gremlins he ever fixed, in 50 years of fixing things, came down to that. Electricity needs a path back to where it started, a ground, And if it doesn't have one, nothing works, no matter how perfect everything else is. The fanciest engine in the world is a dead lump of metal if the electricity can't find its way home. Remember that, it's the whole story. My dad used to say it was the truest thing he knew about machines, and about people both. He'd tell me, wiping his hands on that red rag he always had in his back pocket, that most things that quit working, engines, lights, marriages, men, quit for the same reason. Not because the big important parts broke, because some small, cheap, unglamorous connection came loose and nobody bothered to check it, because everybody was too busy looking at the expensive stuff. They always go for the engine, Russ, he'd say. Nobody ever wants to crawl under and check the ground. There's no glory in it. But that's where the trouble lives, 90 times out of 100, down low, in the cheap stuff, in the connection nobody respects enough to look at. I was maybe 8 when he first put that in me, and I didn't understand the half of it then. I understand all of it now. I've spent 30-some years finding out over and over that my father was right about engines, and right about a good deal more than engines. So, the car show. Once a year, our region has a big classic car event. Concours, they call it. Fancy word for rich people showing off old cars on a golf course. I don't usually go, it's not really my world. Those are 6-figure and 7-figure cars, owned by men who pay people like me to touch them and wouldn't shake my hand at a party. But Nina loves cars, gets it honest, and they let kids in free. And she'd begged me, so that Saturday I put on my cleanest work shirt and I took my girl to look at the pretty cars. That's all I went for. To watch my daughter's face light up. And the centerpiece of the whole show, up on a special platform with velvet ropes around it, was a 1973 Porsche 911 Carrera RS. Now, if you don't know cars, just understand that this is one of the most beautiful and desirable classic Porsches ever built, worth somewhere north of $1 million all by itself, in that gorgeous silver with the script down the side. It was flawless. It was a piece of art. And it was, everybody was whispering, completely dead. Hadn't run in 2 years. The owner had brought it as a kind of dare. The owner was a man named Roman Vaughn. You may not know the name, but you know the type. Tech money, a lot of it. The kind of man who collects cars the way other people collect stamps, as trophies, as proof of how much he can afford. And Roman Vaughn was holding court next to that dead Porsche, telling anybody who'd listen the story of it, which was that he'd bought it as the crown jewel of his collection, and then it had up and quit on him, just refused to start one day, and he'd sent it to the most prestigious, most expensive restoration shop in the entire country. A famous outfit, the kind that charges more for an hour of labor than I charge for a day. And they'd had it for the better part of 2 years. They'd rebuilt the engine, twice. Replaced the fuel system, the ignition, the wiring harness. A list of work as long as your arm, something like $200,000 of it. And the car still would not start. And Vaughn had clearly decided to turn his frustration into entertainment, because right while we were standing there, he climbed up onto a little stage with a microphone, tapped it, got the crowd's attention and made his big announcement. $1 million, he said, to anyone here today who can make this car run. The famous shop couldn't do it. The factory-certified experts couldn't do it. So I'm opening it up to the floor, he said with that smirk. Any of you backyard geniuses think you can do what the best in the world couldn't? Step right up, $1 million. I'll even put it in writing. And he laughed, and the crowd laughed, a nervous, rich laugh, because everybody understood it was a joke. It was a man so confident the car was unfixable that he'd staked $1 million on it to make a point about how the experts he'd paid were idiots, and how nobody else stood a chance either. And I stood in the back, with Nina on my shoulders, and I looked at that beautiful dead car, and something my father said started ticking in the back of my head. Because here's what I was thinking. That shop had done everything. $200,000 of everything. They'd rebuilt the entire engine, twice, and a fully rebuilt engine with a brand new ignition and a brand new fuel system and a brand new harness should start. It has every single thing it needs to start. So if it's not starting, after all that, then the problem isn't any of the big expensive things they keep replacing. The problem is something so simple, so basic, so beneath them, that a shop full of geniuses with $1 million equipment never thought to check it. The problem is the kind of thing my dad would have found in about 10 minutes with his reading glasses and a test light. And I want to be fair here, because it would be easy to make those shop fellas out to be idiots, and they weren't. They were probably brilliant, in the way that people who only ever work on the expensive end of things are brilliant. They could machine a part to a tolerance you can't see with the naked eye. They could rebuild a motor that belonged in a museum. But here's a thing I've learned about brilliance, watching it my whole life from the cheap seats. The more expensive your tools get, the more you start to believe the answer has to be expensive too. You stop looking down low. You stop checking the humble stuff. Because in your world, the humble stuff isn't where the problems are. A shop like that, surrounded by million-dollar machines and diagnostic computers, develops a kind of blindness to the $6 bolt. It's beneath them. It genuinely does not occur to them. My dad never had that problem because my dad never had any expensive tools to fall in love with. He had his hands and his eyes and a test light and the humility to start at the bottom every single time. And it turned out the bottom was exactly where $1 million car had been hiding its problem for 2 years. The problem, I was willing to bet my pride on, was aground. Electricity needs a way home. And somewhere in 2 years and $200,000 of tearing that car apart and putting it back together twice, somebody had failed to reconnect, or had left loose, or had forgotten entirely a ground strap, the engine's path home. And without it, you could rebuild that motor 100 times and it would never so much as cough because the electricity had no way to get back where it started. Every fancy thing they did was perfect and pointless, because they'd overlooked the one cheap, humble, unglamorous thing my father taught me to check first. So I raised my hand. I want you to picture this, because I'll never forget it. 300 people in their nice clothes, and a man up on a stage with a microphone, and a hand goes up in the back, a guy in work boots and a clean but faded shirt with a kid on his shoulders. And Roman Vaughn looks at me, and you could see him pricing me out in half a second, the same look I've gotten my whole life, and he kind of smiles and says into the microphone, "We've got a brave one in the back. Come on up, friend. Let's see what you've got." And the way he said friend, with the whole crowd chuckling, it was meant to make me feel small. It was meant to be the start of my public embarrassment, the working man who thought he knew better than the experts, about to fall on his face for everyone's entertainment. I set Nina down, and I knelt down to her, and she looked at me with those big serious eyes, and you know what she said? She said, "Grandpa's grounds, Daddy?" Because I'd told her the story, she knew Grandpa's saying, and I said, "Grandpa's grounds, baby, let's go see." And I took my little girl's hand, and we walked up through that whole crowd to the dead Porsche, and I heard the whispers, and I didn't care, because I had a feeling I was about to do something my father would have loved. I heard a few of them, those whispers. "This ought to be good," somebody said, and somebody laughed. And a year before, broke and worn down and grieving, those whispers might have turned me right back around, but I had Nina's hand in mine, and I had my dad's voice in my head, and a man walks taller when he's carrying the two of them with him. Vaughn made a show of it, of course. He had his people bring the documentation, the whole 2-year file, and he kept up the patter for the crowd, asking me what shop I owned, had I worked on many Carrera RSs, did I need him to call the famous shop and ask their permission, playing me for the room. And I just said, real quiet, "Mr. Vaughn, you mind if I just look at it for a few minutes?" And he swept his arm out, all gracious. "Be my guest, friend. Take all the time you need. Take $1 million worth of time." And the crowd laughed again. So I looked. And here's the thing. I didn't pop the engine cover and start poking at the rebuilt motor, the way everybody expected. I knew the motor was fine. The best shop in the country had built it twice. The motor was a jewel. I went looking for the humble stuff, the grounds. I traced the battery cables. I checked the connections. I got down on the ground in my good shirt with a little flashlight from my pocket, and I followed the wires the way my father taught me, looking for the path home. And it took me a while because they'd done such a thorough, expensive, beautiful job on everything else that the problem was well hidden underneath all that perfection. And then I found it. There's a main engine ground strap on that car, a braided cable, about as thick as your finger, that bolts the engine to the chassis and gives all that electricity its path back to the battery. its way home. And when that shop had pulled the engine the second time, to rebuild it the second time, somebody had reinstalled everything. Except they'd never bolted that ground strap back down. It was just hanging there. The bolt was gone. A $6 bolt. The strap was dangling loose against the engine, touching nothing, connected to nothing, and so the entire electrical system of that $1 million car had no way home. The starter couldn't get the juice to turn. Nothing could. $200,000 of immaculate work, and the whole thing was dead as a stone for want of one $6 bolt and the 30 seconds it takes to tighten it. I almost laughed out loud, kneeling there, because it was so exactly, perfectly my father. It just needed a way home. I asked one of Vaughn's people if they had a hardware kit, and somebody produced a tray of assorted bolts, and I found one the right thread, and I want you to understand it cost about $6 if you bought a whole box of them. I bolted that ground strap back down to the chassis good and snug. Path home restored, 30 seconds of work. And then I stood up, and I wiped my hands on my pants, and I said, "Mr. Vaughn, you want to try starting her now?" And he gave me a look like he was going to enjoy this, like he figured I'd just gone through some pointless motions and was about to be humiliated. And he nodded at his guy to turn the key. And that beautiful silver Porsche, dead for 2 years, immune to $200,000 and the best experts in the country, that Porsche fired up on the first crank and settled into the sweetest, throatiest, most perfect idle you ever heard, and the sound of it rolled across that whole golf course. And 300 people lost their minds. I have never heard a sound like that crowd made. Because everybody there understood instantly exactly what they'd just witnessed. The best shop in the country, 2 years, 200 grand, and a guy in work boots fixed it in 40 minutes with a $6 bolt. People were on their feet. Nina was jumping up and down, screaming, "Grandpa's grounds," at the top of her lungs, which nobody understood, but which was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. She was 7 years old, and she didn't fully grasp what $1 million was, but she understood completely what had just happened, which was that her daddy had done the thing Grandpa taught him, in front of everybody, and it had worked. To her, it was the simplest thing in the world. Of course it started. Daddy checked the grounds. She'd been telling the grown-ups standing near us the whole time, this little kid, "My daddy's gonna fix it, he knows about the grounds." And they'd smiled down at her the way you smile at a kid who believes in her father. A little sad, a little kind, sure, she was about to be disappointed. And then she wasn't disappointed. Then she was vindicated, completely, at the top of her lungs, and the grown-ups who'd smiled at her were staring at me with their mouths open. And I tell you, watching my daughter be right about her dad in front of 300 people who doubted us both, there is no amount of money on this earth that touches it. And Roman Vaughn stood there next to his roaring Porsche with his mouth open and the color draining out of his face, because his $1 million joke had just come due in front of everyone he was trying to impress. But here's where it stops being just a funny story about a rich man getting his comeuppance. Because what happened next is the part that actually matters. Because once that car was running and the crowd was buzzing, somebody, one of the other collectors, an older gentleman, asked the question out loud that everybody was thinking. He said, "Roman, how in the hell did that shop miss a ground bolt? For 2 years? At those prices?" And it was a good question. It was the question. How does the most expensive, most prestigious restoration shop in the country pull an engine twice and forget to bolt the ground strap back down, and then charge a man $200,000 and tell him the car was unfixable? And I, kneeling there packing up, said something I probably should have kept to myself, except it was true, and it needed saying. I said, "Mister, with respect, I don't think they missed it." And the whole area went quiet. And Vaughn said, sharp, "What's that supposed to mean?" And I stood up and I told him the truth as I saw it, mechanic to customer. I said, "Mr. Vaughn, a shop that good doesn't forget a ground strap by accident. That's the first thing any of us check. It's the cheapest, most basic thing there is. A first-year apprentice knows to check the grounds." I said, "Think about it. As long as that car wouldn't start, what did they get to do? They got to keep it for 2 years. They got to rebuild that engine twice, at what, 80, 90,000 a pop. They got to replace the fuel system, the ignition, the harness, all the big-ticket items, all the high-margin work, and bill you $200,000 chasing a problem that was a $6 bolt the whole time. A problem they could have fixed in 30 seconds the day you dropped it off. I said, I can't prove what was in their hearts. Maybe it was just arrogance. Maybe they were so busy being the best that they never stooped to check the simple thing for 2 whole years, which is its own kind of damning. But a man would be a fool not to wonder whether a shop figured out real quick that a car that can't be fixed is a car that keeps paying, and decided that a loose ground strap was the most profitable thing that ever happened to them. You could have heard a pin drop on that golf course. And then the older collector, the one who'd asked the question, went a little pale, and he said, quiet, I sent them my Gullwing. 18 months. $140,000. They told me the wiring was fundamentally compromised. And another fella nearby said, I've got a Ferrari sitting in their shop right now, going on a year. And you could see it moving through that crowd of collectors like a cold wind, all these rich men suddenly looking at each other and doing the same math, wondering how many of their unfixable problems and endless invoices had been, all along, the most profitable kind of lie. Wondering how many $6 bolts they'd paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to not have tightened. I didn't set out to do that. I just came to show my kids some pretty cars. But sometimes the truth is a loose thread, and all you do is tug the one you can see, and a whole garment comes apart. And I'll tell you why it worked on those men for so long. Because it's the same reason it works on regular folks at the corner garage every single day, just with smaller numbers. People trust a reputation. They trust the fancy address and the glossy brochure and the certificates on the wall, and they assume that the more something costs, the more honest it must be, which is exactly backwards from how the world actually runs. The truth is, a big reputation is the easiest place in the world to hide a lie, because nobody dares question it. Those collectors handed over their cars and their checkbooks and turned off their suspicion entirely, because surely a shop that famous wouldn't cheat them. And that trust, that turned-off suspicion, was the whole con. The shop wasn't selling repairs. It was selling the comfort of not having to wonder. And the cruelest part is that a working man like me, at my little garage, gets watched like a hawk over a $400 brake job, while a shop in a marble building bills $200,000 for a loose bolt and gets a thank you note. I've made my peace with that. But I won't pretend it doesn't gall me. That famous shop, by the way, I'll tell you now, since you're wondering, did not survive the year. Once those collectors started comparing notes and started bringing in outside mechanics to look at their unfixable cars, it turned out a remarkable number of those cars had remarkably simple problems buried under remarkably expensive invoices. There were lawsuits. There was, I heard, eventually an investigation. The most prestigious restoration shop in the country went down in flames, and it started with a guy in work boots and a $6 bolt and a thing his dad taught him. I take no pleasure in people losing their jobs, and I'm sure there were honest folks who worked there. But the men running it had been fleecing trusting people for years, hiding behind their reputation and trading on the fact that their customers couldn't tell a ground strap from a camshaft. And that finally caught up with them on a golf course on a Saturday afternoon. The truth has a way of finding its path home too, I suppose. It just needs somebody to give it one. Now, the $1 million. Here's where you might expect me to tell you I refused it. That I said, keep your money, mister. I didn't do it for that. And I'll be honest with you, because that's the deal on this channel. I thought about it for about half a second, because some part of me felt strange taking a rich man's stunt money. But then I looked down at my daughter, and I thought about my father's garage drowning in his medical debt, and I thought about the man who just tried to use me as entertainment for his rich friends, and I'll tell you exactly what I decided. I decided I'd earned every penny of that $1 million, and I was going to take it, and I wasn't going to feel one bit bad about it. Because here's the thing about the kind of false humility where the working man nobly refuses the money. It lets the rich man off the hook. Roman Vaughn made a bet, out loud, in writing, in front of 300 witnesses, certain he'd never have to pay, because he was certain a man like me could never do what his experts couldn't. Refusing his money would have just been doing him a favor. It would have let him keep his million and his story about how he was generous to the little guy who wouldn't take it. No, sir, he bet $1 million that I was nobody. He lost, and I made him pay it in full with a smile, and that, making a man who looks down on you actually pay what he owes you, is its own kind of dignity. Sometimes the most self-respecting thing a working man can do is take the money he earned and not apologize for it. And to Vaughn's credit, and I'll give him this, once the shock wore off, he paid it. He was a proud man and a bit of a cruel one, but he wasn't a welcher. He wrote me a check for $1 million, and as he handed it to me, something had changed in his face. The smirk was gone. He looked at me and at Nina, and he said, quiet, just to me, "My father was a machinist. Worked with his hands his whole life. I think he'd have liked you a lot better than he liked me." And I didn't know what to say to that, so I just shook his hand, and I said, "He'd have been proud of you for paying up, Mr. Vaughn. That's not nothing." And I meant it. And he nodded, and I think maybe, that $1 million bought him something too, something he needed more than the money. A reminder of where he came from. A free lesson in what his money had been doing to people. I hope he took it. People can change, I've seen it. So, what did I do with $1 million? First thing, I paid off my father's debt, the medical bills, the mortgage on the shop, all of it, so that Calloway & Son was finally, truly, free and clear, owned outright, the way my dad never got to see it. And then, I fixed the place up, the way he always wanted and never could afford. New lift, new roof. Kept the old sign, though, Calloway & Son. And then, I did the thing I'm proudest of, the thing that actually made it worth it. I took a big chunk of that money and I started a program. At the shop, free, on Saturdays, where I teach kids whose families can't afford much how to work on cars, the basics, how an engine works, how to use a wrench, how to check the grounds first, always the grounds, because electricity needs a way home. Kids who don't have a dad to stand them on a milk crate and teach them, the way mine taught me. I figured the best thing I could do with a rich man's million was to give a bunch of kids the one thing my father gave me that was worth more than any of it. And Nina is my best teaching assistant. 7 years old, and she can already explain to a kid twice her age why a perfect engine won't start if the electricity can't get home. She learned it from me. I learned it from my dad. He's gone, but the lesson isn't, and now it's in a dozen more kids, and someday it'll be in a dozen more after that. That's the real inheritance. Not the tools, not even the shop, the knowing. I still run that little 2-bay garage on the county road. I'll never be a rich man, even with the $1 million, because I put most of it right back into the shop and the kids' and my daughter's future. I drive the same truck. I get up at the same hour. Most of the folks in town just know me as Russ, who fixes their cars, same as they knew my dad, and that suits me right down to the ground. But every now and then, I think about that Saturday, and that beautiful dead car, and 300 fancy people who were sure I was nobody, and I have to smile. Because they were all looking at the wrong thing. They thought the answer had to be as expensive and complicated as the car. The shop thought so. Vaughn thought so. Everybody in that crowd thought so. And the answer was a $6 bolt and a thing a small-town mechanic told his boy on a milk crate 40 years ago. The world is so sure that the big problems need big, expensive, complicated answers, and that the people with the fanciest tools and the biggest reputations must be the ones who know best. And sometimes they are. But sometimes, more often than you'd think, the thing everybody overlooked, the simple, humble, cheap thing right down at the bottom that nobody important would ever stoop to check, the thing your father knew, is the whole entire answer. Most of the dead engines in this life just need somebody humble enough to check the grounds. They just need a way home. My dad never knew about any of this. He died 4 years before that car show, broke and tired, never knowing that the thing he said 10,000 times standing over an engine would one day win his boy $1 million and bring down the fanciest shop in the country and put a free wrench in the hands of kids who needed one. He thought he was just an ordinary small-town mechanic who never amounted to much. He was the smartest man I ever knew, and the whole world just walked right past him his entire life, the same way they walked past me in the back of that crowd. The difference is, I got my one Saturday where everybody finally saw it. He never did, so I carry it for both of us now. That night, after the car show, after the check and the chaos, I took Nina out for ice cream, just the two of us, and she was quiet for a while, working on her cone, and then she looked up at me and said, "Daddy, is Grandpa happy?" And I had to think about how to answer that, and I finally said, "You know what, baby? I think today Grandpa is real happy, because everybody finally got to see how smart he was. You and me, we showed him." And she nodded, very satisfied, and went back to her ice cream, and I sat there in that ice cream shop and I cried a little behind my sunglasses, the good kind of crying, because she was right. We'd showed him. The old man got his day at last, 4 years too late, through a $6 bolt and a little girl yelling, "Grandpa's grounds," across a golf course. So I'll leave you with this, and then I'll let you get back to your day. Somewhere in your life right now, there's a problem everybody's throwing money and experts and complicated answers at, and it's not getting better. A thing at work, a thing in your family, a thing in yourself. And I want you to do what my dad taught me. Before you tear the whole engine apart again, get down low and check the grounds. Look for the simple, humble, overlooked thing at the bottom that everybody's too important to check. Look for the loose connection, the thing that just needs a way home. 9 times out of 10, that's where the answer's been hiding the whole time. Tell me in the comments if you've ever found one of those. A great big problem that turned out to be a $6 bolt. I love those stories. I collect them like my dad collected old wrenches. And if you want to pull up a stool and stick around for the next one, you know where that subscribe button is. No hard sell from me. I'd just be glad of the company. We've got more to get into, you and me. Trust me, it's a good one.